Good
Hey,
morning.
what's up, everybody? Good morning, Max. Very good to see all of you. Welcome back. How's everyone doing? Oscar's doing well. Good morning. Good evening, Efren. It's good afternoon here. I think it's still, frankly, technically good morning there. Very good to see you all. We're dealing with a new topic, and this one's really interesting because a lot like last week, we're discussing something that's not an institution in the sense that it's a rule of the game. Instead, we're discussing something that's an institution in the sense that it's a set of actors within the larger system, and they structure our participation in the system. In civil society and the state will be our two points of focus in this discussion. And really, what we'll be talking about is civil society and how civil society consists of organizations and entities that we belong to and participate in, and in doing so, participate in public politics and relate to the state and to party politics and the rest of the political system. And as you'll see in democracy, a civil society becomes especially important because, as a channel for participation, civil society helps to control the state. It helps to constitute political parties and political movements. It helps to put in motion a lot of the things that become essential to the functioning of the democratic state. And you'll talk about that, and I'll talk about that in this discussion. And as always, I'm going to incorporate you with some activities and some interactions. But we'll start first and foremost by introducing the concept. And I want to do this by giving you an example that will help us to begin by thinking about some of the issues at hand. And the example is Tunisia. Tunisia is a place that's been in the news in the last decade because of the revolution that took place in 2011 and the eventual transition to democracy that resulted from the uprising. And Tunisia is a good example of civil society because the revolution and the transition were largely a product of the political activity and explosion in civil society and the ways that civil society groups confronted the state and the authoritarian regime and threw it from power, partly with the help of the military, but primarily through the organization of civil society groups and the leveraging of their influence and their voice. It all started, though, in 1987 when the dictator Ben Ali took power. That year began this episode that eventually ended in 2011, but it wasn't until many, many years later that the seeds of the revolution were really planted. But in the early years of Ben Ali's administration, he won and survived with the support of middle class and urban groups. And these groups were privileged and really key beneficiaries of his administration and his rule because of his reliance on them and how he would funnel benefits to them through public policies and a variety of privileges that really created an advantageous position for those groups. But all the while, lower class workers, students, workers and unions, peasants, religious groups became increasingly dissatisfied and discontented because they fell behind while urban groups and middle classes surged ahead. And this process of dissatisfaction and discontent continued to fester. And by the early 2000s, this lower class student movement and popular movement was really at odds with the authoritarian regime. And by 2011, the dissatisfaction and the discontent could not be contained. And in that year, the neglected groups rose up to overthrow Ben Ali. And they did so through popular uprisings and the organization of student movements and workers' movements and religious groups and agricultural groups and a variety of different groups that were very, very well organized and very vocal and very institutionalized and very effective proponents and articulators of the interests of their individual civil society organizations. And this is a story that is fundamentally about civil society. In Tunisia, the revolution and the transition are a product of changes in civil society that themselves were sort of a product, an unintended consequence of the consolidation of power by Ben Ali with the support of these middle class and urban groups. And I want to use this example to explore the concept of civil society and its functions as an institution of democracy. And what we'll be doing is we'll be exploring the concept and we'll eventually return to the case of Tunisia, where we'll consider some of the functions of Tunisian civil society, and we'll try to explore whether civil society is currently promoting or inhibiting democratic consolidation in Tunisia. And so this is a conversation about the themes that we're discussing, but also about the potential for democratic transformation in one of the best cases of all, which is Tunisia. Before we continue, I actually want to show you a video that helps to put this in perspective and brings focus to some of the issues and the themes at hand. And we'll see in particular the role of student movements and student leaders in the period immediately after the Tunisian revolution. And this will set the stage for our discussion of the concept of civil society.
Almost 3 months after the revolution that ended the 23-year reign of Tunisia's aging autocrat, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, the atmosphere on the streets of Tunis is one of anxious calm mixed with anticipation. Evidence of the revolution is everywhere. Slogans are scrawled across banners and walls, and red and white Tunisian flags flutter in the early spring sunshine. The police, who played a central and often brutal role under the former regime, are barely visible. In their absence, soldiers, the temporary custodians of public order until a new government is formed, loiter behind barbed wire that's tangled around any meeting place or monument where trouble might or did erupt. For the most part, their presence is barely noted as passers-by head to work or to meet friends in the city's cafes.
La rue n'est pas la même que la première période de l'après-révolution tunisienne.
Sabi Kalfoui is a student activist who spent time in jail during the revolution.
C'est beaucoup plus calme. On continue toujours à parler de la politique, à attendre les élections. C'est le retour à la normale, quoi.
Now that the barricades have come down and life is returning to normal, assorted revolutionaries, government officials, and hopeful office seekers have begun the business of building a new democracy. Since Mr. Ben Ali fled on January 14th, Tunisia has had 3 interim governments. The first 2 were short-lived. Many former members of his constitutional democratic rally, the RCD, played starring roles, prompting further protests and violence.
La contre-révolution, elle est certainement là. On ne peut pas imaginer qu'un parti politique qui a gouverné la Tunisie pendant 55 ans lâchera prise facilement. Aller directement aux élections pour concrétiser la valeur démocratique et le côté démocratique de la révolution.
Any vestiges of the RCD will have to contend with some 70-odd parties expected to register ahead of the July Constituent Assembly election. Communists, socialists, unionists, Greens, human rights activists, Islamists are all clamouring to be heard. A likely front-runner in a new government is the Liberal Democratic Progressive Party. Maya Shribi is its Secretary General.
Nous sommes en phase de compétition et le citoyen tunisien a besoin de connaître les partis un à un. Après un certain moment, je suis sûre qu'il y a des partis qui vont fusionner et qu'il y a d'autres partis qui vont peut-être rester petits.
Another party that could benefit from this fragmented landscape is Nahda, Tunisia's main Islamist party, which was banned under Mr. Ben Ali. Party leaders say they want a democratic state in which women will play a full role, but there are fears that Nahda contains some extremist elements. Secularists find their participation in a democracy problematic. Ajmi Larimi is a senior member of the party who spent 17 years in jail.
Il n'y a pas de raison pour avoir peur des islamistes, surtout, je dis, du courant islamiste qui est majoritaire, pas des petits groupes, non, c'est-à-dire de la grande tendance et d'une façon générale centriste, modérée, qui veut concilier valeurs traditionnelles ou valeurs islamiques et valeurs démocratiques.
But there are fears that Nahda contains some extremist elements, and that after almost 2 decades in exile or in jail, the more moderate members of the party are out of touch with contemporary Tunisia. With its tree-lined boulevards and political slogans drawn from Enlightenment thinkers, Tunis seems a cosmopolitan
So this is the case of Tunisia. And we're going to be exploring Tunisia throughout this unit. And the reason that Tunisia is so important is because civil society was instrumental in the revolution and in the transition to democracy. And it wasn't just instrumental in terms of bringing about the resignation and the collapse of the authoritarian regime. It's also been instrumental in some ways in inhibiting the consolidation of the democratic system that took its place. And that's one of the wrinkles and one of the twists in the story that's profoundly interesting and that we'll be engaging with more on Friday. But for now, where we are is the early moment in the aftermath of the revolution, where we can plainly see that civil society, through student movements, student groups, labor groups, religious groups, civic groups, all played a critical role. So we can define civil society as the realm of organized social life that is voluntary, self-generating, largely self-supporting, autonomous from the state, and bound by a legal order or set of shared rules. So these are essentially just those civic and social organizations that we know and love and that you very well belong to yourself. These are student movements, churches, professional associations, women's groups, trade unions, human rights organizations, producer groups, the press, civic associations, you name it. These are those tried and true civic and social groups that are autonomous from the state, that support and sustain themselves, but that also articulate some identity or some interest or some preference, and maybe even confront authority or participate in public politics. And the part that we'll focus on is their participation in public politics, in the ways that civil society groups become political and how they become part of democratic politics, especially. And for those of you who know Karl Marx, you may enjoy learning that he himself said that the anatomy of civil society is to be found in political economy. And by that, he meant that civil society is fundamentally those social and economic groups, those socioeconomic groups, those producer groups or social classes, those associations associated with particular parts of the constituency of the system, and so on. You can think about conceiving of them as the parts of the society. This is a really useful way for us to understand civil society, but I'd like you to keep in mind that civil society is complex and nuanced, and that just as there are these moderate, run-of-the-mill groups, there are also the groups on the margins, the extreme groups, the groups that might seek to destroy the state altogether and not recreate it, just as long as it's in their image. Anarchists are groups in civil society, just as human rights organizations are groups in civil society. And so civil society doesn't have a particular slant. It's all about popular organization above all. And we'll see on Friday that with this in mind, it's possible to imagine a good and a bad civil society, a civil society that promotes democracy and a civil society that does not promote democracy. and we'll talk about what kinds of civil societies those would be. But a civil society, generally speaking, has three defining features. The first one is a set of public goals or objectives that relate to the construction or the constitution of the public realm, the ways that political institutions should be set up, the ways that the different institutions of government should relate to each other, the ways that the popular masses should participate in politics, the ways that decisions should be made, and so on and so forth. These are public objectives, objectives that relate to public life and politics, not the private lives of citizens, but those decisions that all private citizens would have to obey should those decisions be made. And so these are public objectives. Michael asks, did the concept of civil society exist prior to the Enlightenment thinkers? I don't know if it did, Michael. I think that civil society as a concept has a lot to do with, well, Renaissance and Enlightenment thinking about liberty and participation in republicanism. But I can't say with much certainty because I haven't studied those periods enough to know. The second feature of civil society is a distinctive relation to the state. And this is an especially important point. Civil society organizations, like the ones that you may belong to, church groups, student movements, popular civic organizations, these organizations are autonomous and independent of the state. Okay, you're not captured by or subordinate to the state, but you are protected by the state. You enjoy and depend on the right to take positions and voice opinions and engage in debate or object to government decision or policy. You are protected by the state, but not captured by the state. You are related to the state in that you enjoy this protection, but you are independent from and autonomous from the state. In this regard, the state makes it possible for civil society to exist, but it does not impinge on civil society. When the state does impinge on civil society, we begin to talk about the difference between a democratic and an authoritarian state. A democratic state is one that carves out and leaves and supports space for the exercise of these political rights and civil liberties through civil society organizations. The authoritarian state, by contrast, crushes dissent, eliminates that space, crowds out objectors, and sends them into hiding. And so the relation to the state will depend on the type of state. And so, for instance, in China, it's well known that religious organizations operate basically underground because the Communist Party is an atheist party and it has an official policy of no religion, and it doesn't permit popular organization in religious groups. And so church groups are not protected by the state. As members of civil society, they don't enjoy the protection of the state. And so their relation to the state is one that forces them into hiding and that forces them to operate basically underground. By contrast, in the United States, clearly the situation is very different. Church groups enjoy the protection of the state. They are tax-free. They are members of civil society. Now, they also often increasingly engage in politics. That's a separate issue. But as I've already discussed, civil society organizations do oftentimes inject themselves into politics and participate in public politics as a part of democracy and democratic life. Now, the third feature of civil society is that it's pluralistic and diverse. By definition, civil society is abundant and diverse and pluralistic and multidimensional. It represents interests by definition. And so all sorts of all sorts of religions, all sorts of ideas, all sorts of groups, all sorts of interests. A robust civil society is dense with networks and with organizations that might represent a whole range of cross-cutting cleavages. And so the pluralism in the system is its treasure. And so a civil society is by definition going to be complex and sophisticated in that tapestry of interests and groups and movements and so on and so forth. Now, let's begin to think about civil society in its relationship to other institutions that we've already discussed and that we've already become familiar with here in class. And I want you to focus on the unfolding relationships in the ways that these different institutions sort of overlap, in the ways that they fit together, in the ways that they relate to each other. And so we start with civil society, and we have our civil society here in the very center of the social system. There we are. You see that? All of us are crammed into this little tiny circle. Get comfortable because we all have plenty of space. We're in this circle right here. And what you'll notice piece by piece is that the rest of society sort of goes up around it. So on the one hand, we've got the private sector or private society. You are an individual with private interests and a private identity. And as an individual with a private interest and a private identity, you are here. But you might also be a worker or a religious person. Maybe you are a student. Maybe you are a volunteer or a participant in a civic organization. And so while you are a private individual here, you're also a member of groups that are here in civil society. And so your private identity and your private interests will overlap to some degree with your membership in civil society organizations that may take positions in politics. And so you're in civil society, but you're also a private individual. And so you can imagine then how they kind of overlap. But then as a member of a civil society organization, either as a member of a labor union or a peasant organization or a church group or a student movement, a parent-teacher organization, a civic organization, a volunteer, so on and so forth, you're also bearing some relation to the state because that state is protecting your right to organize in that group. And that state might also be sanctioning and sort of licensing or kind of supporting and making official that group to which you belong. If it's a labor union, if it's a employers association, if it's a civic association, it's very likely that your organization has a legal identity that is protected by and really constituted by the state. So as a private individual who belongs to civil society organizations, you bear some relationship to the state. You depend on its protection. If you don't enjoy its protection, you might be subject to its punishment or its repression, in which case you might be forced underground or into hiding or into exile. Ideally, it would be a democratic society, and that state would protect you and would protect and support your civil rights and your liberties as a member of society who is an individual belonging to private or civil organizations. Now, there's even a fourth domain of society, and that is political society. This is essentially the party system. So all societies, as you know, create latent demand for distinctive political representation. And therefore, societies produce political parties. They just kind of pop up, right? They just pop up all over the place. And we know that the parties that get representation depends on the electoral system, and it depends on which cleavages are activated and which ones are not. But there is a relationship between that civil society, where as an individual, you belong to civic organizations or labor organizations or church groups, and party system and political society, where there are political parties and political movements. Now, it could be that your civil society group to which you belong, a labor movement, for example, has a close relationship with a left-leaning political party. Maybe you're a landowner and you belong to a landowners association and you have a link to a right-leaning or a conservative political party, and so on and so forth. You are a member of civil society groups that are autonomous and independent of those parties, but those parties also in some way relate to and depend on your support. And so they form their preferences and their vision and their agenda partly based on their relationship with civil society groups to which you belong. And so here you have it. You can imagine all of society sort of represented in these different domains, and they all essentially revolve around civil society. And civil society, again, is that domain of voluntarily organized collective groups where they engage in collective action and share some collective identity or some collective interest. And this is then how we can understand these different components. Now, what I would suggest is that if I could do this again, I actually might have private society overlap with political society a little bit, and state and political society overlap a little bit with with each other as well. But you do get the picture. I think that the most important point of all is that civil society is really the center of the entire system. Everything else in some way or another revolves around civil society. So civil society then is a critical component of the overall picture. And we can't really imagine the state, the political society, or the private sector without the role of civil society. And similarly, we can't really imagine civil society without private society, political society, and the state. Now, for the same reasons, civil society has a lot of really critical functions in a democracy. When we talk about democracy, a lot of what we talk about implies a role and a responsibility for these civil society organizations to which we belong, these civic groups, these labor and employer associations, these church groups, media groups, student action groups, feminist and women's groups, advocacy groups, and so on and so forth. In the first place, these groups control democratic governments. They exert pressure and they create powerful incentives for elected leaders and governments to follow certain courses of action and not follow others, or to stand down if they have pursued a course of action that is objectionable or undemocratic or against the interests of the larger society. These voluntary organizations, these civil society organizations, can function in a lot of the same ways that political parties do when parties are in the opposition. They try to scrutinize and challenge and control the government by exerting control, by exposing wrongdoing. You know, for the same reason, if it's not a democracy, if it's an authoritarian state, civil society organizations have a critical role to play democratizing the state and transforming the regime. They have this function and this responsibility because the state will better support the civil society under that circumstance, but also because they're representing the interests of individuals and also political parties. And those actors, their interests are at odds with the state. And so the civil society becomes the instrument for representing the interests of common people in opposition to the authoritarian state. The civil society also fosters participation. Think about the groups that you might belong to. Even if those groups don't exist for political purposes, they very likely help to connect you to politics in some meaningful way by fostering your attention or your interest in politics, by increasing or improving your sense of importance or your political skill set, your sense of civic duty. These are important components of a civic culture that supports democracy and that sustains and helps to consolidate democracy once it's in place. These norms and these values and these patterns matter a great deal. And when they're fostered by civil society organizations, they help to both strengthen individuals, but also the organizations themselves. And so there's there's an important role to play then for mobilization and communication and disseminating information and a lot of the things that we would consider important functions of political parties too. Now, on that note, in the same way that parties provide channels for interest group or interest representation, civil society organizations do too. So churches, media groups, student movements, feminist or women's rights groups, these groups provide means of interest group representation that stand outside of parties or corporatist arrangements created by states. And they are autonomous and independent of the state. And so often what that means is that they they enable groups to behave more true to form and express their preferences in a purer way than if they, say, had to rely on corporatist arrangements where the state sets up channels for negotiations between the state groups and other groups. Social movements and civil society organizations are important in this way because these alternative means of interest representation usually lead to a better and a more accurate articulation of interest than if that wasn't the case. For a similar reason, civil society organizations can help to mitigate conflict between organizations and between the state and between society. And so civil society organizations like student movements can become essential in helping to foster and create dialogue between governments and movements that oppose them. And so, for example, in Chile, especially under socialist governments in the past, the student movement has been very successful in entering into dialogue with governments because the student movement is well organized and because they're able to speak with one voice. In this way, they help to mitigate conflict as well because it makes it possible to enter into a dialogue where one might not exist otherwise, and where opposition to the government might be more dispersed and less well articulated. So civil society can be confrontational and yet still productive and democratic at the same time. And that's the usefulness of civil society in a democratic sense, among other reasons. There's also the fact that civil society organizations recruit and train new political leaders. People who get into politics get in through political parties, but oftentimes they get into parties through organizations or through movements as activists, as students. In Chile, for example, I know I give these examples a lot, but I know the case quite well. Some of the youngest and most exciting legislators in the Congress got in through the student movement and through the student movement's success and eventually forming a new coalition called Frente Amplio, which has successfully challenged the traditional coalitions on the left and right, and in recent years has led to at least 9 or 10 students gaining seats in Congress. These are examples of new political leaders who've been trained and recruited by the student movement, not by political parties. And moreover, that's an example of civil society creating political parties because of the strength of the civil society on its own. And we'll talk in subsequent discussions about why civil society movements become strong and maybe why they don't become strong. Similarly, in a similar way, civil society groups promote democracy because by exerting control over governments and scrutinizing their behavior and exposing wrongdoing, recruiting new leaders, mitigating conflict, they help to strengthen democratic institutions because they reinforce and validate and legitimize and really show the acceptability of the institutions. By playing by the rules, by accepting the rules, they promote and they deepen the rules. And so in Tunisia, for example, the student movement was a central part of the revolution because they organized a lot of the opposition to the authoritarian regime. In subsequent years, the student movement became essential to promoting democracy because they would continually call on the parties to adhere to the new rules, to represent society, and to accept the rules of the game despite their electoral defeat should they encounter defeat. Remember that one of the issues was that there was extreme fragmentation and that inevitably many of the parties would be defeated in the first elections. And so one challenge would be holding democracy in place when so many parties hoping for victory wound up with defeat. The student movement and civil society organizations become critical to promoting democracy if they help to keep the actors committed to democracy despite outcomes that they find unfavorable. I also mentioned that civil society disseminates information, much like political parties. Strong organizations communicate well, and they communicate effectively, often by speaking with one voice and by policing the information that they disseminate so that it's effective and meaningful. And that's one way that this Tunisian case can be understood too. Part of the success of the revolution was the communication of information, especially via encrypted technologies like WhatsApp, if I'm not mistaken. And then civil society organizations can also facilitate economic reform, especially if they help to create political acceptability among groups that otherwise might object to reform. The civil society groups can become part of the bargaining and the negotiation process too. Economic reform is very, very difficult, and it imposes losses on some of the beneficiaries of the status quo. So whenever you can use existing organizations to produce acceptability or obtain consent, it is a useful approach. And so in this way, civil society groups can matter too. Now, for all of these reasons, civil society can also strengthen the state. By promoting transparency, by promoting accountability, by promoting scrutiny, visibility, state institutions become more responsive, and they're forced to become more democratic, and they're forced to become more efficient and more accountable and better at governing. And that strengthens the state, and it makes it ultimately more legitimate and more valid in the eyes of those who must accept and obey its rules. And that acceptance and that strengthening and that legitimacy that it gains can be a critical component of overall democratic strengthening. And so this is the importance of civil society. And what I want to do now is begin to step back and consider the functions of civil society, but also think about what those functions depend on and why civil societies succeed or fail at what they set out to do. I'm curious also, what are the sources of power for those civil societies that are powerful? What separates a capable civil society from an incapable civil society? And so on. In a moment, I'm going to bring up a document where we can do some brainstorming, but someone did make a comment in the chat. Jake said, is this similar to the Justice Democrats in the US? No, it's not. A little bit, Jake. The Justice Democrats these are grassroots activists. That's true. They are activists who often began as activists or organizers, right? AOC is an example, and they've joined conventional traditional political party, the Democratic Party, but they are a progressive wing of the party. In that regard, it's not the same. In Chile, they formed an all new party and a set of parties, and that coalition is called Frente Amplio. Now, that's not a breakaway faction of an older party, that's a new set of parties. But generally speaking, the same idea applies, right? It's a faction or a breakaway group. Although I think a key difference is that you're right, though, in both cases, the new political movement emerged out of civil society organizations. It's just that in Chile, it's students. In the case of the Justice Democrats, it's grassroots organizers and activists. But I'm going to copy and paste this, everybody, and I want us to begin to address these questions and do some brainstorming before we continue next week, or excuse me, on Friday. All right, you should be looking at a Word document that's got these 3 questions on it. And I'd like to just do some brainstorming and hear from as many of you as possible. Does anyone want to take on any of those 3 questions?
I'll let you tackle number 1.
Okay, go for it, Jeffrey.
So when it says what does civil society's ability to perform its functions depend on, I would say that civil society depends on one another. Simply because when we talk about the way I look at it, because I remember learning in POLI 1 how just like an interest group, people need to depend on one another and need to, with so much how do I put it, that people need to basically try to basically have less free riders as possible.
Yeah.
Because free riders are basically people that gain the benefits of what the group has already put in. Basically all of the work that is done, everyone is doing as a collective, everyone's doing the work, everyone's working together, and you have these group of people that just are basically gaining all the benefits without having to put in any work, or people that are just not volunteering either for the organizations, for the interest group, or they're not participating in the parties at all, and they're just basically just gaining anything anything as much as possible, but they're not participating at all or putting any efforts. That's what I will say.
Describing the collective action problem, and there are 3 sources of collective action costs. And the problem basically arises when the group gets too large to effectively enforce the group strategy, to ensure that the organization of the group is sound, and to make sure that individual benefits are sufficiently large that individuals have a reason to participate and cooperate. This is the challenge for any civil society group or social movement. And there's a key problem here. And the problem is that, how do you organize so many people effectively? And this is a question for you and a question for me and a question for all of us. And I'd like to hear from as many of you as is possible who want to keep talking about this issue while I incorporate some of the input from students who are using the chat. So how much information the public has is a component, suggests Samantha. Michael, can you explain your point about the social contract? So Karen says that cooperation is essential. I would agree, right? Cooperation matters a great deal because if you have all these people but you can't work together, how does that help you? Absolutely. Efren says for question number 3, I would say that a powerful civil society source of political power could come from fostering participation and increasing political efficacy. Now, those are things that the civil society accomplishes or achieves if it's powerful, right? But how does it achieve those things? What makes it able to accomplish those things? And I want to pose the question, how does a group foster participation? If that's the source of its strength, I mean, it's got to have something that gets it there, right? What makes a group capable of fostering participation? Sabeth, what do you mean diversity?
I think diversity would be in the way of thought, the way of thinking, and the way of approaching circumstances, I would say.
Okay, so is more diversity good?
Yes, I feel like it's needed.
Neither.
And this was the first question.
So it has no effect?
No, I feel like it's needed to function.
Oh, it's needed. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay, so you might need diversity, right? So maybe differences are good. And although that might make it harder to cooperate or create a common agenda, maybe that diversity is useful because there's strength in that. Perhaps you could create a larger movement and the movement could be more valid in the eyes of the larger public if it contains people from larger or more wide-ranging set of groups, and that would be diverse from the perspective of Sabeth. Absolutely. So diversity might make the group more valid or legitimate in the eyes of the wider public. And that could be especially important if, for example, they need to achieve something extraordinary, like the removal of the authoritarian government and a transition to democracy. It's like in Tunisia, for example. Listen, everybody, we're out of time. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to incorporate your input in this notes, this document that I've made for us, and I'll save the responses and I'll upload the notes to CAC courses. And that's it for today. I'll see you on Friday. Thanks so much for being here, everybody.